Alright, so I got a pretty wild clip here for you guys, which is honestly just another great reminder in terms of how casually hawkish our corporate media outlets can be at times. So this is from MSNBC, right, the supposed left-wing network out of our corporate media apparatus, and basically you're going to hear this host here suggest that if the Iran nuclear deal is not revived, if Iran continues to enrich uranium to higher percentages, then the United States or some sort of an international force or Israel might have to just straight up step in and invade them, as if it's just sort of like an inevitable thing that we absolutely have to do. So let's just go ahead and jump into this, and then I'll give you guys a little bit of my thoughts on it. And just as a heads up, the audio on this clip here, posted by Case Study QB, shout out to him, unfortunately is like kind of messed up and bad quality, but nonetheless, let's just go ahead and jump into this clip here.
Iran has taken a big step in its nuclear program, increasing its enrichment of uranium and use of advanced centrifuges at 2 nuclear sites, according to their official media, steps that had been outlawed under the Iran nuclear deal from which President Trump withdrew. Tehran has begun enriching uranium to 60% purity at its underground Fordo nuclear site, according to the country's nuclear chief, Adnan Natanz, a big step toward being able to produce weapons-grade uranium. And joining us now is Ambassador Karen Pierce, the British ambassador to the United States and Great Britain's former UN ambassador, as well as ambassador to many important posts. And Madam Ambassador, it seems that Iran is getting increasingly closer to having enough nuclear fuel for a weapon. Is it possible that we're getting to a point of no return here, and that Israel or some other power, even, the U.S. and its allies, might feel that they need to take action to restrain Iran?
Well, we were pleased that the international authority that looks into atomic energy was able to pass its resolution. I think the decision that we've learned about today on what Iran is doing really proves what a risk to global security Iran is, as you say. We are talking to our partners and allies about the best response to this, but I will point out that a nuclear deal has been on the table since March. And we really would urge the Iranians, even at this late stage, to show that they're not a global threat and to take that deal. Otherwise, we will have to think about the consequences, and we are increasingly worried about what Iran is doing.
Okay, so first off, the media angle of this, right? I mean, this host is just, the way that she framed the question, right? I mean, she doesn't even ask this question in even a remotely neutral way or with any of the context or background in terms of like what's actually being proposed in the deal. Why has Iran been hesitant to rejoin it? Why are they continuing to enrich uranium, right? She just straight up says, if they continue on this path, is this going to lead to Israel or the United States or some sort of a global coalition having to go in to interfere in that process, which I don't know how you could possibly interpret that other than meaning that we would invade the country or militarily, step in to prevent them from doing that. Because, you could make the argument, oh, maybe she was indicating we should impose sanctions on them. We've already been doing that, right? Since Donald Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, which, just as a reminder, it was signed under Obama, right? That was sort of the backstory of all of this. It was signed under Obama. Iran, as far as we know, according to the international agencies which were overseeing this, they were fully abiding by the deal. It was basically just a deal to, prevent certain portions of their nuclear capabilities from eventually enriching to the point where they would be able to develop nuclear weapons and, be able to have those in their stockpile. Now, it was only like a certain window of time, like about 10 years, where that would be applicable, giving us time to then potentially work out a more longer term deal, right? But then the Trump administration comes in and he not only pulls out of the deal, but then uses all of these different sanctions and sanctions them even more than the sanctions that were dropped when we joined the Iran nuclear deal, levels even more intense sanctions at their economy to the point where they have just been completely strangled and isolated for years now. Okay, it's had massive, terrible effects on their economy for a long time now. And so that's what the Trump administration decided to do. What was his justification? He didn't have any real justification other than the fact that it was a deal that was signed by Barack Obama. He's not a fan of Obama. Maybe he thought that he could take a different, more hawkish approach to it or get some sort of a better deal on the table. Obviously, that was complete nonsense. But not only did he pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, Then a couple years later, he almost sparks off, World War III by going and just willy-nilly assassinating Qasem Soleimani, this top Iranian general, while he was going on a diplomatic trip within Iraq, and decides to just drone strike him into oblivion, which was a massive escalatory move that he just decided to take randomly. And so he does all of that, increases tensions with Iran, sanctions them as maximally as you could possibly do, and then we get to the situation now where we have Obama's vice president, Joe Biden, who's coming into the White House. He ran in the 2020 campaign on getting the Iran nuclear deal revived, but here's the kicker, right? We were the ones who pulled out of the deal, which Iran was fully in compliance with, and now Joe Biden and his administration, as a part of these ongoing negotiations, they are refusing to drop some of these sanctions that the Trump administration put in place, which again were even more severe than the ones before the first deal was even put in place. He's refused to take those off of the table as an act of goodwill or good faith in these negotiations to try to get them back to the table in a more serious and legitimate way that could actually revive the deal, right? Which is just a completely ridiculous situation at face value, right? Why should the onus be on them to go back to the situation before they started ramping up their enriching of uranium? Why should they have to revert back to the status of the deal, a deal that we pulled out of, right? I mean, how does that add up in any way, shape, or form? We should be the ones who go back to the table and say, we're going to drop these sanctions, and as long as you, continue to abide or start going back towards abiding by the parameters that were outlined in that original deal, or, maybe a new deal that has slightly different parameters, then you could start doing that, right? But we have to be the ones, since we're the ones who pulled out of the deal and stabbed them in the back throughout this entire process, we have to show or demonstrate a little bit of goodwill towards their government or towards their leaders, so that they are able to actually justify doing that to their own people or to their own government, right? So I mean, that's just my basic thoughts in terms of the deal. Now there's a bunch of other things that you could also mention when talking about this, right? Obviously Iran over the last couple of weeks, or I guess maybe months at this point, has been having pretty significant protests domestically in the aftermath of Masa Amini being killed by the Iranian morality police. Those protests are still ongoing. They are pretty widespread across the country still to this day. The Iranian government has been incredibly brutal in cracking down on those protests and killing just dozens of innocent men, women, and children who are trying to go out and protest for more social freedoms and things like that. So there is that domestic analysis, which is important to mention. Obviously this is an incredibly brutal government. I'm not saying that they're amazing or that they represent my values or anything like that, but you kind of have to sort of separate the analysis of the brutality that they are engaging in on a domestic front versus what would be good in the terms of like long-term peace and stability within the region. And that would obviously be, even if you go at it from the angle of critiquing their internal domestic policies, if you hate the Iranian regime, you would think that the necessary follow-up to that would be, well, maybe we should try to aggressively prevent them from obtaining a nuclear weapon using the tools that we have at our disposal, other than straight up invading them, as I guess that host was sort of just mildly suggesting there, right? So I mean, again, this seems like it's like a super complicated and a drawn out process that's going on here, but at the end of the day, it's not that complicated. Okay, we could get back into this deal if the United States was willing to make some concessions that again are basically just showing that we are able to actually negotiate in good faith, and that the next time that some other president, maybe Donald Trump in 2024 or Ron DeSantis, or whenever a Republican gets back in power, that the Iranian government is not just going to get stabbed in the back once again, as Donald Trump, demonstrated that he was willing to do when he was the president just a couple of years ago, right? There's no reason for Iran to halt this process of trying to obtain a nuclear weapon if that's what they're trying to do. There's no incentive there for them to trust us in this negotiation, knowing that in a couple of years, if, Joe Biden ends up not being the president anymore, that they could just pull out of the deal again and screw them over on that front. So you have to understand the perspective that the Iranian government is going into these talks with, and then factor that in when you're deciding how you are going to go about engaging with, sanctions relief or any other portions of that deal. Now, there's a couple other things that are kind of important to mention in this in terms of, what has been the blockade, how has this been, stalled out for so long, and why has it taken so long for us to even get to the point where we're seriously discussing getting back into this deal. So one of those external pressures is obviously coming from Israel, which is massively hawkish against Iran. Iran is also pretty hawkish against the state of Israel. And so, of course, the Israeli Israeli government officials has been lobbying the Biden administration to not even entertain the prospects of getting back into a revived Iran nuclear deal. Now, there's a lot of reasons that go into why Israel and Iran have a lot of beef. Obviously, that goes back years and years and years. But the idea that like Israel is stepping up to the plate and trying to lobby government officials against this deal, what is the incentive there? I mean, what is the point of not getting back in this deal from the perspective of Israel? Well, the only interpretation that I could possibly glean reasonably from this type of rhetoric that's coming out of this government is basically that they would just rather go to war with Iran, because I mean, you just heard it from this host here, right? The view of the United States, the view of a lot of our allies within the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia or especially Israel, basically the view is that you either revive the Iran nuclear deal and stall out the prospects of them getting a nuclear weapon for at least a number of years, maybe it's a decade, maybe it's 15 years, whatever the case may be, or the alternative to that is you basically just go to war with the government of Iran and try to, I guess, dislodge the regime that is currently in power, right? Those are really the only two options that are on the table. Either you get back into the Iran nuclear deal, take that off the table for a decade or so, or they just continue on the path that they are on right now. And from the perspective of the United States, our military industrial complex, from the allies that we have in the region, then we would inevitably have to go to war with them because they are going to continue enriching uranium because we are not back in the deal, right? So I mean, there's only a couple different ways that this can play out, and it seems like Israel would much rather just straight up go to war with Iran. And I bet there's a lot of people within the United States government and State Department and political apparatuses who would also like to see that be the inevitable eventuality of this situation. But I mean, obviously, I don't have to tell you guys this, but going to war with Iran, I mean, that would be absolutely psychotic. You want to talk about how destructive and catastrophic the effects were from us invading, Iraq or Afghanistan, for example. I mean, these wars were, cost thousands and thousands of American lives, but also hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives of Iraqis and the people of Afghanistan. I mean, so many wasted lives as a result of these wars. And what did they achieve at the end of the day? I mean, the Taliban is back in power in Afghanistan. The Iraqi situation is still, somewhat chaotic and destabilized to a large degree. And basically, this entire process of us trying to go into these different countries and, insert our will, insert our values, and do some sort of like nation building process, it's been a complete abject failure. And, in the meantime, we have obviously, also had all of these other compounding consequences on top of that, right? I mean, trillions of dollars that were dumped into both of these different wars, and the consequences of going to war with Iran would be even greater than either of those wars, right? We're not talking about a country that is like just a couple of people, or a country where they don't have a substantial military that could fight back against this. I mean, this would be an absolute unmitigated disaster if that was a path that we were going to inevitably go on. And so on top of that, you also have the notion that if the United States was going to go to war with the government of Iran, what would the end goal of that be? Well, if it's to do regime change, well, I mean, how do you think we ended up with the current, government structure that is in Iran right now in the first place? Well, you got to go back to the 1950s when we toppled their democratically elected government that was in place and basically installed the Shah of Iran, who was slightly more progressive on social issues, but was, massively right-wing and corrupt when it came to economic issues. And because of that leader that we ended up putting in place, you eventually had the Iranian Revolution in 1979 that then installed this more theocratic government in place, right? So, I mean, you could definitely make an argument that the United States is semi-responsible for the current situation that the Iranian people are facing with this current government that's in power right now, because we set off the chain of events by toppling their democratically elected leader. And now we're back at a situation where I guess we're just basically casually talking about it within the highest ranks of, the military, and within the highest ranks of our government, and within the highest ranks of our corporate media apparatus, about just doing this again and just going for, Iran meddling to Electric Boogaloo. And so it's just a completely ridiculous situation where the focus should be on getting back to the deal as quickly and efficiently as possible, demonstrating to the Iranian government that we are a partner in that deal that can be trusted in the long term. Maybe you set up some sort of parameters in it where, a single U.S. president is not even able to unilaterally pull out of that deal if, they take back power in 2024 or 2028 or something, and just aggressively try to push for that direction, because the alternative would just be an absolute disaster for all parties that were going to be involved in this.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying